I read The Singularity of Being, Lacan and the Immortal Within by Ruti. This is an academic book that I've read before in an effort to try and learn about Lacanian philosophy, I guess, is how I look at it. I don't know if Lacanians see what they believe as philosophy since it's based on psychotherapy. And so maybe the approach is supposed to be more scientific, but that's not generally how I understand it. Anyway, all of that to say that I read a lot of secondary Lacanian literature like this and have never engaged with the primary text of Lacan because in the past I've engaged with primary text and then go to secondary text and have a really hard time grappling with it because I've formed my own ideas and understanding and really wrestle with the formal and, I guess, normal academic interpretation of things since I'm an autodidact and just like take the text as I read it and form my own associations. It leads me into trouble. So I'm trying to get to know Lacan in a peripheral way and then go to him directly afterwards, which is kind of funny when you learn about Lacan and you learn about like desire and the way that we approach the things that we want in a kind of circulatory way. Maybe that is what I am doing and just putting off learning about Lacan because of the way that my desire operates. I don't know. Of the people that I've read in academia, this book is like aimed at other academics who are Lacanians, but I find it pretty approachable as a person who hasn't read the primary text, who doesn't have a really firm grasp on all of the ideas that go into Lacan's formulation of the mind and how desire operates and all of those kind of things. All of that to say that Ruti's work, for me, is the most approachable Lacanian that I have found. So in the book, she goes over the major three Lacanian kind of modes of reality or perception, or this is one of the things that I'm confused about. But I think I understand it. I feel like I understand it while I'm reading the book. And then when I come away from it, it's harder for me to articulate. So there's the symbolic, there's the imaginary, and there's the real. And the symbolic is like society, I think. It's like the ways in which we deal with each other, the symbolic order. It kind of mediates our dealing with each other. And then there's the imaginary, which is the way that you deal with yourself and like your self-image and all of that kind of thing. And then there's the real, which feels kind of Kantian to me. It's like something that you can't really talk about. It's bigger than language, it's bigger than perception, and it intrudes in all kinds of ways, or it both intrudes and constitutes sometimes the way that reality operates. And so there's something about it that is always kind of stirring the pot of our psyche, I guess. And so like maybe that is all totally wrong and I don't understand it, but that's the way that I kind of grasp onto the three major ideas in Lacan's system: the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. And then what she's doing in the book is talking about how there's an almost kind of like existential emanation that arises from these three aspects of our psyche to create a kind of singularity of who you are and how that is like special and distinct in a very particular way. Like it's weird. what she's doing feels very existential to me, like existential philosophy, except it's like completely not existential philosophy. It's not Sartrean or any of the other existentialists, because like so much of it relies on the unconscious, and those guys just don't truck with that. And so it's like a completely different way to formulate existentialism, I guess. It reminds me of like Hobbes or something. This is a really weird comparison, but like Hobbes is able to formulate a reason why government forms in the absence of a god, which is like a thing that in his philosophical tradition people did not do. It was like, God is like a king, and then blah, 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 hierarchy of being. Therefore, we have a king and we have dukes and barons and blah, 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 blah. We have a hierarchy of authority that, not only did God make it, but it is in the same form as God, and therefore government. And Hobbes is like, nah, let's take God out of the equation, and here's another explanation for why government can happen, and it totally works all on its own, and you actually don't need God to be there at all. In the same way, Ruti is kind of like, this existentialist project doesn't need a deeply considered mind that understands every aspect of itself and grapples with the way that it was thrown into the world that pre-exists it and responds to it in a very intentional way and creates this existential project that's ongoing and on blah, 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 Sartreanism and all of the other French existentialists. Instead, she lays out the ways that there's a kind of negativity or lack in our experience, in our psyche, and that in the building around it creates a kind of psychic pressure that moves us in ways and forms us in very particular modes that when we step back and look at the whole picture of the person is particular in a way that cannot be repeated. It's not like we're all kind of machines or expressions of a particular kind of equation, the way that maybe you could talk about Freudianism and in his system. Like you could imagine just a kind of blank Freudian human being who, for whatever reason, it's almost like a computer program, like some bad code gets in there or something is messed up, and then you just figure out where the wrinkle in the programming is, and then boom, they're right back to being a normal Freudian subject. Her argument is that there is no like blank subject, that we are all particular singular selves, and that what we are constituted of is the interaction between these three elements. Super interesting idea. I'm not totally sure that what I just said made any sense, or that it is even correct about what she is saying, because a lot of this flies above my head. And she also, because it's an academic book, she's not only like deep in the jargon of Lacanianism, but she's also deep in pulling in other writers and sources. And basically, like, the whole thing is in conversation with other Lacanians in a way that, like, you should be really familiar with all of these other people. And some of them, like, I haven't read any of their stuff at all, which is part of the journey of doing this. Like, you read someone and they reference someone, and then you go find their stuff and you read that and you come back to the first text and you figure out, how the conversation is working. But because I don't know those other people, it's a little bit difficult for me to totally understand what she is talking about sometimes. One of the arguments that she seems to be like in dialogue with other Lacanians has to do with the real and the way that I spoke about it as a void, but she argues that there's a real like kind of creativity to the real, that its intrusions don't have to be purely destructive in our psychological experience. They allow us to they free us from the imaginary. And so we kind of limit ourselves in the way that we both see ourselves and see like the horizon of possibility for action. And the real can interrupt that in important ways and offer up new possibilities. And other Lacanians don't necessarily read his concept of the real in that way, is what I take from the text. The way that I relate to all of this, and the only thing that really gives me a bedrock, I feel, as I read any of the Lacanian stuff, and I think it's also part of why I'm attracted to it, is because it feels very much like a Western reach towards Taoism, a kind of construction of Taoism through an almost kind of materialist disposition, which is interesting to me. I'm a Taoist, sort of, I guess, as much as any white person in America, especially living in the Midwest, could possibly be a Taoist. I read Taoist texts, but I'm not associated with like a temple or a master or anything like that. And I contemplate the Tao, but that's about as much of a Taoist as I can be. All of that to say that the way that Taoism works feels very similar to what she is talking about in this book. So, for example, in the Tao Te Ching, it talks about an example of the Tao being a cup, and how the cup has a form, it has a bottom, and it has the sides. But the useful part of the cup is the void in the middle. That is the thing that you want the cup for. But then in actuality, what you want is whatever you're filling the cup up with. And so its usefulness is in being a container for which the void is necessary. And then once you have the filled cup, you're in a position where you can't really receive anything else in the container. And so in order to receive something new, you have to empty the container and reassert the void. And so all of that, this is how the Tao Te Ching, it's very typical of its articulations, because all of that is like super obvious. Like we all know how a cup of things works, but is also kind of profound because you can see the obvious metaphor. And when I think of the example that's used in the book in Lacanian theory of the vase maker, and the thing that the vase maker is actually constructing is the void around which they are wrapping the vase. And then the vase will be used to, hold whatever it's going to hold. And so the vase is a totality of not only the void that it has, and not only its exterior that we might admire, and its shape and all of that kind of thing, but also whatever it may contain at any given time, even, I guess, if it's empty. And so in the combination of these things, that asserts its kind of singularity, or, its existence. This kind of existentialism that I'm trying to associate with Ruti. I mean, maybe she would hate that association, but it seems to me that it's not unrelated to existentialism. But Taoism has a similar association with the void. The void is not merely receptive, but is generative. And that is part of why in the Tao Te Ching it says over and over that the female is greater than the male, because the female is both receptive and generative. and that we must always return to the female. And this articulation of Lacan that Ruti lays out in the book feels very much like that, that there is an action that we undertake in pursuing our desires where we sublimate the energies of our desires into achievable little projects that can be completed within the kind of constraints that society gives us. And so we're not allowed to go full out, and completely enjoy our realization of our desires, because it might like completely destroy us or cross lines that would be too intolerable to the rest of society or to the people around us that we care about, and on like that. So for me as a Taoist, the Tao is in all things, but it's not as if there is only a singular Tao out there, like God or something, but that the Tao, everything has its own Tao, and that is also synchronized to a greater way of being, to the entire universe. And so everything that exists is a kind of sublimated articulation of the Tao into materiality, I guess is what I'm saying. So like the universe itself is sublimated Tao in a certain way of thinking about it. And the way that ethics are spun out of the Tao is similar to the claims that she makes about ethics and their relation to desire, which is again related. It seems to me it's almost like a mirroring of Sartrean existentialism, and like the protests against existentialism. You'd be like, well, what if my personal project is death camps for people? It'd be like, why you can't stand in the way of my death camps? It's my existential project. But it's obviously not ethical, and she's able to articulate the ways that the ethics don't arise from the negativity. That is to say, there's a way of reading Lacan that seems to kind of totalize the real and minimize the other two parts of the formulation as interrupting some kind of more important aspect to the world or our perception of the world, and therefore like overemphasize the kind of negativity of the real, and therefore produce what seems to be like complete acts of desire, or things like terrorism or like murder or like love affairs that stand outside of the mores of society, and that these are somehow sanctioned or sit in some kind of privileged area because they come in contact with the real. And Ruti's argument is that they lack an authenticity because they don't incorporate the other two zones of the Lacanian construction. And so it's like trying to pour water into a vase that doesn't have a bottom or doesn't have walls. I mean, she doesn't say it like that, but that's how it seems to me. And it's the understanding that I have, again, from Taoism in the concept of balance, and also of thinking through a deep kind of consequentialism that's important to Taoism. So there's, in other words, they're kind of seeing a totality or a wholeness in not only your actions, but also the origins of your desires and beliefs and thoughts. The whole order of having a belief that turns into a thought that becomes an action has a totality to it, has a wholeness to it. And the idea that we could just, simply touch some kind of root of desire, and that would be more important than all of the other steps along the way. I agree with her assertion that feels wrong, and it abrogates any kind of actual ethical behavior. I think the ethics arise naturally when you're taking in a totality, which seems to me to be what she's saying, that the ethics are built in to the whole process and are discoverable and feel authentic and normal when you are connected holistically to an awareness of, not only your imaginary zone or not simply sunk into the symbolic, but where you have an awareness of the real, and you're not trying to steer things too hard in any of those directions, where you're allowing some kind of flow to happen. But I don't know. It's like I just feel like I'm babbling. I don't know if I'm really like articulating anything special or clear about what Rudy's saying, or I guess basically the point of this podcast project is for me to say things off the top of my head about the books that I read, because I'll eventually go back to these recordings and kind of help me see where I was, and compare that to the journey of where I am the next time. But I'm not sure that I'm describing anything in particular about the book, or just my own kind of take on the secondary Lacanian material and the Tao Te Ching, or the Tao in general, and the ways that I see connections between those things. But I don't know. Maybe that's all that comparative reading ever is anyway. But her work, like I said, feels very illuminating. And when I'm reading it, I do feel like I really understand and am able to follow the things that she's saying. And then when I pull up out of it, I feel overwhelmed and tired and a little bit confused. And then when I try to talk about it, I kind of stumble over myself and reach for other formulations and, like Taoism and things like that, in order to kind of prop up my understanding. So to me, that says that like I'm not there yet. I don't have a firm grasp on it. Maybe it's time to reach into the primary text of Lacan, or maybe I should read some of these other people that she mentions in the book that I haven't touched before. So I'll have to come back to the book again, probably again and again and again, to get closer to getting a grasp on this pretty complicated formulation of the mind.